Hi, I'm Valentine, and God has a crush on me. Sierra DeMulder. I have just accepted a very generous offer for an excellent scholarship in a super prestigious Dutch university for my master's in comparative literature, which means we made it, baby. I'm moving out of Israel. I'm moving to Europe. It's a new chapter. I could not be more excited and more grateful. But those of you well versed in my lore will know that I was supposed to start a master's this year already in my Israeli uni, actually, because my first year of bachelor's here, I received a tempting offer that I have been tempted by, to my great chagrin. I received a tempting offer to transfer into the French department out of the English literature department and do my bachelor's in 2 years instead of 3, and do a master's with a full ride scholarship, and then right before the beginning of the school year, in like August or late August, I found out that I can't do the master's that I already prepared for, that I already selected a supervisor for, that I already created a corpus for. I'm getting there because the person who promised me all of these things just did not bother to verify that all those things were doable or realistic or existed. And I was racking my brain how to celebrate this huge achievement, this huge change in my life for the better, being accepted in the Dutch uni. And what better way to do that than reminisce on what could have been and how grateful I am that it did not come to pass. Because no disrespect to my current uni, but all disrespect to my current uni. You know what you did. Or maybe you don't. You don't seem to have any self-awareness as an institution. This research proposal that I had for a master's in Israel was about Aphrodite and Venus and a little bit Sappho in like Belle Epoque literature, late 19th century, early 20th century literature in France in particular. So my entire corpus is just things that have Venus in the title or talk about Aphrodite in some shape or form. This is not going to be a particularly in-depth or even trustworthy account of all of these books because most of them I have not read. I was too salty at first and then I just sort of forgot. I got busy. I just want to hang out. Times are rough right now for everyone, and I think we deserve it. A figure that was absolutely unavoidable if I wanted to talk about Venus at all in 19th century was Pierre Louÿs, and Pierre Louÿs is a freak. There is no way around it, okay? He's a nasty man. He's a freak. He's a freaky freak. In a good way, but also in a deplorable, disgusting way. You'll see what I mean. Pierre Louÿs wrote primarily erotic stories, which in and of itself is not weird. It is freaky, it's not weird. And he was particularly obsessed with ancient Greece. The particular kind of nastiness I'm talking about, although there was a lot. He had all kinds of nasty underbellies. The particular kind of nastiness I'm talking about here is he fetishized lesbians to an extreme degree. It was one of his obsessions. He is the absolute reigning champion, I think, in fetishizing sapphic relationships. And in fact, his most famous work is the Songs of Bilitis, or Les Chansons de Bilitis. And what's fascinating about this poetry collection, because it is a poetry collection, is it's actually a literary fraud. It started out as a literary fraud. Let me explain. He faked it being like a collection of poetry he uncovered and translated by a Greek poet who lived at the same time as Sappho, which is why the book is in my corpus, because Sappho in the 19th century, early 20th century, sort of functions as an intermediary figure between Aphrodite and us common folks. Like she's this priestess of Aphrodite in the imagination of that time. and also someone to imitate, but that's more for women authors. We'll dive into this a little later. He wrote a whole like biographic academic note at the very beginning explaining who she was, and he very cleverly put like fake names of academics in the preface, saying that all of these academics already studied the text, and it worked. I don't know why, but like it worked embarrassingly. Academics at the time, intellectuals at the time, wrote articles about this, pretending they already knew about Bilitis before reading this poetry collection. And then Pierre Louÿs did reveal that he wrote it. I don't remember why he confessed to it. Maybe just because like it became very successful and he wanted that sweet, sweet glory. Maybe he just got caught. I genuinely do not remember. That's the kind of storytelling. That's the kind of factual information you came here for, clearly. And the poetry collection pretty much covers her entire life story from her early childhood until her death, because she basically writes her own epitaph at the very end. Most of the poems are about her love life, and a lot of them are super erotic, but I will admit that if I could forget for a single second that it was written by this nasty, nasty man, I will admit I'm quite a fan. I reread it. It is one of the few books on this list that I reread, and I like it. I do like some of it. I do like parts of it. In fact, I have like a page torn out of an old edition on my wardrobe right there. You probably can't see it, but it is there. Trust me. Let me read this just so I get this right. In 1955, the Daughters of Bilitis was founded in San Francisco as the first lesbian civil and political rights organization in the United States. In regard to its name, Delmartine and Phyllis Lyon, two of the group's founders, said, "If anyone asked us, we could always say we belong to a poetry club." To this day, the Songs of Bilitis is sort of iconic in the sapphic space, and I love that for us/them. My gender identity is quite rocky, but I love it. I love the reclaiming of it. I slay. However, what's incredibly funny to me, my favorite fact about Pierre Louÿs, is he was so homophobic when it came to gay men. He believed basically that a union between a man and a woman, it's alright, but it's not ideal. The ideal union is between a woman and a woman. And when it's just a man and a man, there's nothing there worthy of, respect and admiration because there's no woman. He was friends with Oscar Wilde for a little bit, and friends is a strong word. He hung out with Oscar Wilde a couple times, and he was quite a fanboy, but then one time he came over to London. I'm pretty sure it was the second time he saw Oscar Wilde in person. He comes to London, and that was at the time where Oscar Wilde was living in a hotel with his lover Bozzy. He left his wife, he was just staying at a hotel with Bozzy. My favorite part is when Pierre Louÿs very earnestly tells Oscar Wilde, choose between me and being gay. Choose between me and being a disgusting sodomite. Who do you think you are? Which was precisely Oscar Wilde's reaction. His response was iconic. He said something along the lines of, I wish I remembered it word by word, but he said something along the lines of, I wanted to have friends, but I guess from now on I'll just have lovers. And he also said hey, I don't remember granting you the right to judge me. Preach. And then his best friend also got initiated into being gay. That's a weird way to put it, but he got his gay awakening and got encouraged in his gay tendencies by Oscar Wilde. So Pierre Louÿs cut ties with his best friend as well, but imagine being Pierre Louÿs. And Rachilde, though, I do not embrace as a gay representation icon because he was very proudly a pedophile. But that is not the last work by Pierre Louÿs on this list. We also have Aphrodite. And as you can see, the title already makes it mandatory for my corpus. So Aphrodite is set in ancient Greece as well. And I think it's only titled Aphrodite because it sort of plays on the myth of Pygmalion, the sculptor who sculpted a lady and fell in love with her and then prayed to Aphrodite and the statue came to life. It's about a sculptor, and that's where my knowledge gets quite murky. It's about a sculptor, and he sculpts a lady, and at first he wants to sleep with her, but then he sleeps with her in his sleep, and now he doesn't want to sleep with her anymore, but she wants to sleep with him now, and he like dares her to a bunch of daring criminal escapades just to earn sleeping with him. Doesn't end well for her, and there's a crucifixion of a female slave. Was that necessary, Pierre? Was it? I think it's like a reflection on a very, very common trend in literature, in decadentism in general, where it's like a woman in her natural state is disgusting. But if you make of her a goddess, an objet d'art, an object, if you will, then it becomes tolerable. And like the more artifice, the better. So like a sculpture of her is more precious to him than her. Or like a vision of her in a dream is also more precious to him than her and her life. It's been several weeks and I've been sick for pretty much all of that time, and I stubbornly refused to cancel any of my plans, which, as you might imagine, did not allow for the swiftest recovery possible. But anyway, so next up on my corpus's list of freaky freaks, we have Rachilde. And Rachilde is the pseudonym of this woman writer, also like end of 19th century, beginning of 20th century. That is pretty much a given for all of the writers I'm talking about because that's my period. Where do I even begin with her? Honestly, it's easier to begin with the book itself because the lore behind the person who wrote the book, I could be at it for hours. So I need to collect my thoughts and make my choices, and while I am busy doing that, let me just chat at you about the book itself, the reason Rachilde is even part of this whole undertaking of mine. Monsieur Vénus, or Mr. Venus, is a novel about a noble lady called Raoul, which already is a very masculine name for your information that's going to be important later. She is very bored with all of her suitors and her life in general because it's so vapid and empty, a very common theme in decadent literature. None of the decadent plots would be happening if it wasn't for these aristocrats who are slowly rotting from inside, which is why a lot of my friends and acquaintances find this literature insufferable because it's so pretentious and it's just rich people being absolutely insufferable and going crazy and doing unhinged things for the sake of doing unhinged things. I personally find that highly fascinating and entertaining, but that may be a character flaw. So Raoul meets this florist, this poor florist guy, poor as in materially poor, but also poor as in poor guy, I feel sorry for you. She meets this florist guy and she begins a love affair with him, but the kick is she puts him in a very submissive, feminine position, almost making him undergo like forced feminization in a very degrading, cruel way. Decadent writers very much revel in being as deranged and disturbing as possible in terms of perversion and how far they take that perversion morally, sexually, socially, in every shape or form imaginable. And you'd think it would age rather poorly considering how exposed we are in the 21st century to all kinds of disturbing imagery in our media. But I would argue, even from reading the synopsis, a very detailed synopsis of this novel, it remains impressively unhinged. Fun fact about this book is it inspired Oscar Wilde when he was writing The Picture of Dorian Gray. You thought you heard the last of Oscar Wilde in this video. You were sorely mistaken. Basically, at the very beginning of the book, Lord Henry gifts Dorian this book, Le Secret de Raoul, or The Secret of Raoul, to sort of cement his conversion to the path of sin and hedonism, and his already a burgeoning inclination to just live life for his own sake, for the sake of pleasure, and to try everything, no matter the consequences for other people, and blah, 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 basically leading him onto the path towards self-destruction, destruction of others that he ends up on. And yeah, the title is a reference to Mr. Venus, because Oscar Wilde wanted to pay homage to Rachilde. And Rachilde contributed massively, from what I could glean from cursory research, to Oscar Wilde's legacy surviving it all, in France in particular, because she did a bunch of translations of his work after he got out of prison. He went to prison for homosexuality at the height of his glory, and that completely destroyed his career and his life. And for a while it was believed, it's hard to imagine right now, but for a while even his friends agreed, his former friends agreed that yeah, sure, he was a fascinating person, but he didn't have much talent. There is sort of a companion novel to Mr. Venus titled Madame Adonis, so Lady Adonis. And I don't know if I would have included it in the corpus or not, because it doesn't technically have Aphrodite or Venus, but Adonis is one of Aphrodite's lovers. So maybe, possibly, but it's just about a throuple. It's about a woman meeting a married couple and falling in love with both of them. It didn't sound particularly captivating to me, but I assume since it's written by Rachilde, it's batshit insane, so I will read it eventually. I am somewhat curious, just the premise itself did not give me much to work with. I do not know why it's titled that. I do not know. Nowhere in the synopsis it mentions Aphrodite whatsoever, but for my corpus, for my research, I would have had to analyze why that title would have made sense, and what the implied connection would be, what kind of association Rachilde was working on. Now, for Rachilde herself, she had a very turbulent, very long life. I'm not going to be able to give you a complete portrait, but some things that I find fascinating about her is, first of all, she dressed in men's clothing for a while. She did mess around with gender, which really shows in Monsieur Vénus, as you might have noticed, except she stopped doing that when she got married. Interesting, what happened there? She also believed she was a werewolf. I'm not kidding. Let me cite some sources, okay? So, Rachilde traces her loup-garou, or werewolf, identity back to a story about her great-grandfather, an honorary canon in the Catholic Church who sacrilegiously abandoned his station during the French Revolution to marry Rachilde's great-grandmother in an effort to save her from the guillotine. According to local legend, her great-grandfather's abandonment of the church cast a curse on the next 5 generations of the family line, transforming them into a family of werewolves. Now, she may or may not have earnestly believed it. She does seem like somebody who loved shocking people and provoking people and exaggerating her own eccentricity. However, she was an unwavering vegetarian whose animal liberation resume includes the vandalizing of laboratory vivisection equipment, the freeing of trapped wolves and lab mice, an arrest for obstructing a bullfight, and the establishment of a makeshift animal sanctuary in her country home during the 2 world wars. Next up, we have a poem by Arthur Rimbaud, and Arthur Rimbaud, I will have to make such an effort, such a Herculean effort, truly, verily, not to go into all of the bad shit details of his biography, because he lived an endlessly captivating, tumultuous life. You can say whatever you want about his character, and there's certainly a lot to say. He sounds like a nightmare to be around. He's an absolute menace. However, he is such a captivating figure to learn about, and I read his biography, and I will read more of his biographies, but there's so much, and I cannot justify going into all of it, because the poem is so tiny. All you need to know is Arthur Rimbaud revolutionized French poetry forever and ever before the age of 21. All of his poetry he wrote before the age of 21, and then he left Europe forever. He went to Africa to become a merchant, pretty much. I think he sold weaponry. I do not like Rimbaud's poetry as a rule of thumb. There are exceptions, but I don't like his poetry. Not because I don't recognize how revolutionary and visionary and brilliant and genius it is, blah, 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 but because it's very, very crude, intentionally so. Very much the intention is always to give a giant middle finger to pretty much everyone. It's provocation for provocation's sake sometimes. It's shock value, it's gross, and it's just trying to go against the bourgeois preferences, the bourgeois morals, etc. Anyway, the poem that is in my corpus is one of those poems that I do not like, and it is so gross. The whole point of this poem, which is titled Vénus Anadyomène, so Venus Anadyomene, is to describe a woman rising up from a bath in as disgusting, degrading way as possible, to make her out to be as ugly as possible. Every vocabulary choice is very intentional in that sense. It's just trying its darnest to make this woman the least appealing, the most skin-crawling image you can possibly picture. And I assume that's not a hot take at all. It's a subversion of how Venus is supposed to be, you know, the personification of beauty and sex appeal. And Venus Anadyomène, in particular, Venus Anadyomene, if I'm pronouncing the Greek word wrong, I have a friend who, like, knows ancient Greek, but I didn't want to bother them, so tough luck. If you're watching, brother, you're welcome and I'm sorry. Anyway, Venus Anadyomene refers to this type of Venus representation, Venus sculpture or painting, where she's rising up from the sea during her, birth from the sea foam. So yeah, very clever art here and very mean. Next up, we've got my personal favorite, actually, Renée Vivien, and she is incomprehensibly forgotten. She is a very, very obscure writer. None of my professors ever heard about her, and I feel like that's a crime. Something went wrong. There was a glitch in the universe, because she is the definition of brilliant, and she, like, her exact style and aesthetic are so incredibly, like, handcrafted just for me and me alone. And I'm so grateful I discovered her completely randomly. She was openly a lesbian, and she put a lot of effort into fostering spaces and literary salons for other sapphic women. And in her writing, she's super open about preferring women over men and being repulsed by the idea of heterosexuality. And men, just as a rule of thumb, men in her writing are not. They're not it. And in pretty much all of her writing, either Sappho or Aphrodite or both play a huge center stage role, because she almost wanted to revive the cult of Aphrodite or create a cult of Sappho, where she and her friends wanted to be followers of Sappho and devote their lives to this perceived sapphic ideal. I have like 4 of her books on here. I have La Vénus des Aveugles, so the Venus of the Blind, and that is just a poetry collection. I'm not sure how many poems it has, if any, about Venus or about Sappho or about either, but I haven't read it yet. It's very hard to procure her writing at all. Yikes. But the title, I had to. Then we have Une femme apparue, so a woman appeared to me, and that is a roman à clé, which means like a novel with a key. That's a literary term. It's a type of novel that was very, very popular, very fashionable in that time period. It's when you write a novel and you sort of change the names around, but people who are in the know, people in your circle, can tell that it's a novel about the people in the circle. And it becomes a game to decipher who you're referring to and why and what that says about them and what kind of salacious drama is happening behind the scenes, And it's a stunning, stunning, stunning novel about just lesbians being messy, pretty much. It's about this love affair the protagonist has with another woman who is this modern day priestess of Aphrodite who devotes herself to fostering this community of women who are all in love with her, and the protagonist falls in love with her as well and worships at her feet. However, it doesn't end well because the woman is very heartless and cold and cannot bring herself to love anyone, and the protagonist tries to find solace with other women, but it's not as simple as that, and it's full to the brim with reflections on art and the meaning of life, the meaning of love. Does love need to be happy? Does love need to be healthy? Or is there other ways to give it meaning? And it has an open ending that broke me. I was kicking my feet giggling. I love it so much. I'm going to reread it soon. Then we have La Dame à la Louve, which sometimes is translated as The Lady with the Wolf, sometimes translated as The Lady of the Wolf, and the wolf here is female. It's a feminine name. That is a collection of short stories. I included it, honestly, just cause I could, but it has, I think, one tiny short story about Sappho, and that's it. And finally, we have probably the most fascinating one, Le Christ, Aphrodite et Monsieur Pepin. So the Christ, Aphrodite, and Mr. Pepin. That is basically the story of Christ retold in a true crime format. True crime as in beginning of 20th century, true crime as in, columns in newspapers and magazines. I do not know how Aphrodite plays into that. I'm so eager to find out. It was very hard to procure this book, but I did procure it. And for the grand finale, we have the big bad wolf, Charles Baudelaire. He is most famous for writing The Flowers of Evil. That is the one poetry collection he published during his lifetime. He spent years and years obsessively polishing it, and then he published it, and it immediately was persecuted in court and declared pornography, and all the copies had to be destroyed, and the publisher and Charles both had to pay a huge fine. It was basically charged with outrage à la morale publique, so outrage to the public morals, and it was not a unique case necessarily. Madame Bovary, a very, very, very famous novel at the time, was also persecuted for the same thing, but the author Flaubert was much better off financially and social-wise, like he had a huge standing in the community, so he got off scot-free, but poor Charles Baudelaire was crushed, torn to pieces, especially because he had the same persecutor who just failed to bring Flaubert down, so he was very bitter and salty, and he really took it out on poor Charles. Nowadays, Flowers of Evil, understandably so, frankly, deservedly so, is considered an absolute masterpiece of the French literature, French poetry, and in fact, I can trace my origin story as a poet to reading The Flowers of Evil in high school. The kind of poet I ended up being is completely dictated by my exposure to The Flowers of Evil and how much I connected to it. I was pretty certain that I could use The Flowers of Evil for my corpus because I remembered vaguely from my classes on Charles Baudelaire that there was within The Flowers of Evil this cycle of the Black Venus, which refers to the poems he wrote about his mistress, who was a black woman, and the way contemporaries and especially critics afterwards, throughout like the 20th century, talk about her is so degrading and racist. It's crazy. Anyway, there is this cycle of the Black Venus, and I thought surely the name Black Venus comes from one of the poems, but it doesn't. I think that's what he called her in a letter to his mother. So no, I can't use that. What I can use is, oh my god, you're not gonna believe it. Basically, there is this poem, and it's titled Venus Belga, so the Belgian Venus, And the story behind this poem is when he experienced such traumatic failure in France, he moved to Belgium briefly because he thought he would find success there, and then he didn't, and he developed extreme hatred and resentment towards Belgium and the citizens of Belgium. So he wrote an entire unpublished manuscript where the whole point is just denigrating Belgium and talking about how much he hates Belgium. But this poem in particular, it doesn't come from that manuscript, because that manuscript was like non-fiction, if you will. This poem is just a poem he wrote while in Belgium, and it's literally just about what kind of boobs he likes. There's nothing about Venus in there, there's no high art. It's very, very, very different from his other poems that you find all polished and beautiful and stunning and mesmerizing in The Flowers of Evil. It's just about boobs. Not even just about boobs in general. It's very short, and it's just about his preferences, like what kind of boobs he prefers out of all the possibilities. It's very precise criteria. On a more serious note, he was one of the first authors of a collection of prose poetry, along with Rimbaud. And in his collection of prose poetry, Le Spleen de Paris, so Paris Spleen, there is this very short, once again, prose poem titled Le Fou et la Vénus, so The Fool and the Venus. And it's a prose poem about a fool as in, a court jester kind of fool. A fool finding refuge at the feet of this statue of Venus in the garden and begging her to grant him any love, any sense of being loved in this world, any sense of beauty, because he's shunned by everyone and despised by everyone and degraded by everyone. And Venus just stares at him with, cold eyes, as the perfect embodiment of beauty that she is, the perfect embodiment of art that she is. And there are layers to it. It's a commentary on art and artists. It's a commentary on love and lovers. It's deep, and I will not get to write about it for my master's, because my master's is about something completely different now. My flatmate came home suddenly and spooked me, so now I'm spooked and I'm done. No awkward outro, but bye, see ya, bye.